We all know that Australia is a middle power that benefits from the status quo in the region. We want to keep enjoying the best of both worlds, unconstrained trade with China under the US security umbrella. That situation has served our nation well for more than 25 years. This has been and remains the Canberra policy consensus, that anything that disturbs that regional equilibrium is self-evidently not in our national interest. However, the question tonight is, can China really rise peacefully? And, as our keynote speaker says, will it convert its economic might into military might and seek a strategic sphere of influence across Asia on which China's future prosperity and stability depend? John Mearsheimer will be making the argument that we are experiencing an increasingly intense strategic and ideological competition between China and the United States. And indeed, this week's currency and trade disputes, as well as, of course, China's assertiveness in Hong Kong, are just a sign of things to come. The question here is, what should Canberra do? John Mearsheimer is one of America's most distinguished foreign policy intellectuals. He's challenged the conventional wisdom in Washington on various major public policy issues in the post-Cold War era. From NATO expansion in the 1990s, which he predicted would infuriate the Russians and create a security crisis in Ukraine, to the Iraq invasion of 2003, which he predicted would be a strategic disaster, fanning Sunni jihadists across the broader Middle East. John Mearsheimer is Professor of Political Science at the University of Chicago. He's the author of The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And I think it's fair to say, and this is a widely held view among many foreign policy intellectuals, his book, The Tragedy of Great Power Politics, which I believe is on sale in the CIS lobby, is, along with Francis Fukuyama's The End of History, which was later turned into a book, and Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilizations. These are widely regarded as the three most important intellectual theses of the post-Cold War era. And in recent times, just in the last 6 months, John has published a new book, also available outside for purchase, called The Great Delusion, Liberal Dreams and International Realities. It's a great pleasure to welcome Professor John Mearsheimer.
Thank you, Tom. Thank you for the kind introduction, Tom. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I deeply appreciate everybody coming out to hear me tonight. It's always a very humbling experience to know that so many people are interested in what I have to say. The question on the table tonight is, can China rise peacefully? And before I make the argument that it cannot rise peacefully, I want to make two preliminary points. First of all, I'm simply assuming that China will continue to rise. There are really two questions involved when you talk about the rise of China. One is, will it continue to rise in an impressive way? And then number two, can it rise peacefully? So you just want to understand, I'm assuming that it's going to continue to rise. And then I'm going to address the second question. My second preliminary point is, it's actually a theoretical question, and you have to have a theory to answer it. And the reason it's a theoretical question is because it deals with the future, and we have no facts about the future, because obviously the future hasn't happened yet. So you have to have a simple theory about great power politics. So what I'm going to do tonight is I'm very quickly going to lay out my theory of international politics, how the world works at the great power level, number one. Then number two, I'm going to explain American behavior since 1783, American foreign policy since 1783, in synoptic form, just to give you a sense that the United States has behaved according to the dictates of my theory. Then the third thing I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about how China is likely to behave. And not surprisingly, I'm going to argue that China is going to try and imitate the United States. And that That's why we're going to have this intense security competition between the United States and China that leaves the real possibility on the table of a possible war. Okay? So let me start with my basic theory of international politics. I think that the ideal situation for any great power is to be a hegemon in its region of the world and to make sure that it has no peer competitor, which is another way of saying to make sure that there is no hegemon in any other area of the world. And as will become clear here as we go along, my basic argument is that there has only been one regional hegemon in world history, and that's the United States of America in the Western Hemisphere. Okay? But the ideal, again, from an American point of view, is to be a hegemon in the Western Hemisphere and make sure that no other country is a hegemon in Europe or Asia or the Persian Gulf, but mainly Europe and Asia. Okay? Now, why do I say that? What's the theory here? In international politics, it's very important to understand that there's no higher authority that you can call on if you get into trouble. In a society like Australia or the United States, if somebody comes after you and tries to cheat you in a business deal or attack you physically, you can call the police, you can call your lawyer. There's a state that sits over that society that you can turn to. In international politics, if you get into trouble, there's no higher authority. And the problem that you face is that you may end up living next to a country that has a great deal of military power and it has bad intentions. You might end up living next door to Nazi Germany. Just let's talk about China's intentions, or even America's intentions, or 10, 15 years down the road. There's no way you can know whether China will have good intentions or whether China will have bad intentions. You don't even know who's going to be in charge in China in 10 or 15 years. You don't even know who's going to be in charge in the United States in 10 or 15 years. So you can't know what their intentions are. So when you have big countries that have a lot of military might, and you can't be certain about their intentions, and there's no higher authority that you can call on if you get into trouble, there's a very powerful incentive to be what we used to call, when I was a little boy on New York City playgrounds, the biggest and baddest dude on the block. Because if you're big and powerful, countries don't fool around with you. How many Americans do you think go to bed at night worrying about Canada or Mexico or Guatemala attacking the United States? The answer is zero. Why? Because we are Godzilla in the Western Hemisphere. You understand my point here? You want to be really powerful for purposes of survival. This is a defensive argument. You want to be really powerful because you can never be certain that another state that's more powerful than you or as powerful as you won't come after you at some point. And again, you won't have that higher authority to turn to. So what you want to do is you want to be the hegemon in the system. And my argument is the globe is too big and there's too much water out there for any one country to be a global hegemon. So the name of the game is to be a regional hegemon, to dominate your region of the world, be the most powerful state in your region by far. Okay? And number two, make sure that no other country in places like Europe or Asia dominates its region. So you don't have a peer competitor. That's my basic theory. Now I want to switch gears and I want to talk about the United States of America, and I want to tell you a story about the United States of America that most of you don't know. Certainly most Americans don't know this story because we have this idealistic story about noble America that bears little resemblance to reality. The United States, and what I'm going to do here is try and convince you that the United States since 1783 in terms of foreign policy has acted according to my theory. That's what I'm going to try and do. 1783, the United States started out as 13 measly colonies. strung out along the Atlantic seaboard. What did we do? We marched across the continent to the Pacific Ocean. We murdered huge numbers of Native Americans. We stole their land. We went to war with Mexico in the middle of the 19th century, and we stole from Mexico what is now the southwest of the United States. We invaded Canada in 1812 for the express purpose of making Canada part of the United States. For those of you who don't know, the reason Toronto is not the capital of Canada and Ottawa is the capital of Canada is they expected us to pay a return visit. Furthermore, with regard to the Caribbean, we'd own all of the Caribbean now. Places like Cuba and Puerto Rico would be American states if it weren't for the fact that it was inextricably tied up with the issue of slavery. And the northern states said, we're not going into the Caribbean because there are too many slaves down there. Those are slaveholding states, and we don't want any more slaveholding states. We had a voracious appetite for conquest. Adolf Hitler, when he went into the Soviet Union in the summer of 1941, sometimes talked about imitating the Americans and their ability to conquer and gain territory. He admired us greatly. He was trying to emulate us. He referred to the Volga River as my Mississippi. That's how the United States was created. An expansionist country like we've never seen on the planet before. But that's just the first part of our attempt to create regional hegemony. The second thing we did was the Monroe Doctrine. In 1823, old President James Monroe, he told the Europeans, we're not powerful enough to throw you out now, but there's going to come a day when we're going to run you out of the Western Hemisphere, and once we run you out, you're not welcome back. This is our hemisphere, we run it. No distant great powers are allowed in our hemisphere. It's the Monroe Doctrine. First part of the story I told you is called Manifest Destiny. Marching across the continent from the Atlantic to the Pacific, creating this huge state, importing huge numbers of people, industrializing the country. And then the second part of the story is the Monroe Doctrine, getting the European great powers, the British, the French, the Spanish, all out of the Western Hemisphere. And of course, by 1898, we had done that. We had created regional hegemony. What was our second goal? Our second goal, as I told you, was make sure we didn't have a peer competitor. We did not want any other country on the planet to dominate its region the way we dominate the Western Hemisphere. We had 4 potential peer competitors in the 20th century: Imperial Germany, Imperial Japan, Nazi Germany, and the Soviet Union. We helped contain and defeat all 4 of them. We helped put all 4 of them on the scrap heap of history. We entered World War I when it looked like the Germans were going to win in April of 1917 and helped finish them off. With regard to the Japanese, we beat them single-handedly in World War II, and we helped the Soviet Union, which played the key role in defeating Nazi Germany in World War II. And then, of course, the United States played the principal role in containing the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and then we gladly ushered them down the toilet bowl when they fell apart. The United States does not tolerate peer competitors. That's my basic story. Now, let's talk about the Chinese. My argument, as I told you, is that the Chinese are going to imitate the United States. They're going to want to dominate Asia the way the United States dominates the Western Hemisphere. And of course, you understand my argument is that makes perfectly good sense from their point of view. When I'm in Beijing, I always tell the Chinese, if I were playing your hand, I'd try to dominate Asia. I'd try and drive the Americans out, right? So I don't think they're foolish here. What I'm telling you is they're going to imitate the Americans, and the Americans acted according to my theory, and the Chinese are going to act according to my theory. Why? Because it's the best way to survive in a world where there's no higher authority you could turn to, and you can never be certain about the intentions of other states. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the Chinese. My first point is they're going to want to be by far the most powerful country in this region. And they should be. You know what happened when the Chinese were weak? It's called the century of national humiliation. Chinese know what happens when you're weak. Other great powers pick on you. You don't want to be weak in this system. You want to be really powerful. If you're Chinese and you have 2 choices, 1, you can be 20 times more powerful than Japan, or number 2, Japan can be 20 times more powerful than you. Which one do you think they'll choose? They won't even think twice. to answer they want to be 20 times more powerful than Japan. You want to be 20 times more powerful than any other great power in your region and every other great power on the planet if you can. Why? Because it's the best way to survive in a system with no higher authority. So the Chinese are determined to be very powerful. They're feeling really good about the fact that they're growing economically and translating that economic might into military might. And I don't blame them one bit. It's one thing I like about being an American. We are Godzilla. I don't have to worry about the survival of the United States of America. If you're a small country and you live next door to one of those gorillas, you better be really careful. Cuba, they got uppity with us. You remember when Fidel Castro was running the place? We still have not forgiven them. Right? You want to be big. You want to be powerful. So that's number one. Number two, as I told you, remember the Monroe Doctrine, you want to get the Americans out of East Asia. Right? You don't want the Americans around. We have the Monroe Doctrine. And as my mother taught me when I was a little boy, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. Don't you think they're going to have a Monroe Doctrine? They'll tell you behind closed doors, when we get powerful enough, we're driving the Americans out beyond the first island chain, and then we'll drive them out beyond the second island chain. And again, I don't blame them one bit. If I'm Chinese, that's exactly what I want. I do not want American aircraft and American ships running up and down my coastline. The Americans go ballistic when any foreign country drives military forces into the Western Hemisphere. Some of you are probably old enough to remember the Cuban Missile Crisis. You remember how excited we got when we discovered that there were missiles in Cuba. And then the Soviets talked about putting a naval base at Cienfuegos. We told them in no uncertain terms, you ain't building a naval base at Cienfuegos. This is our hemisphere. We've got this thing called the Monroe Doctrine. Stay out. Well, again, what's good for the goose is good for the gander. So what I'm telling you here is that the Chinese are going to try to dominate Asia for good strategic reasons. And that includes pushing the Americans out. Then the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the Americans going to do? I just told you what the Americans are going to do. We do not tolerate peer competitors. We've got 4 good examples that shows you how in the past we have reacted. And what you see happening now with the Trump administration is what you're going to see for many years to come. The United States is going to get right in their face, and it's going to say, you're not going to dominate Asia. You're not going to become a regional hegemon. It is unacceptable to us. And of course, many of China's neighbors, all you have to do is go to Japan, South Korea, I believe Australia, Taiwan, Singapore, India, right? They do not want to see China become a regional hegemon. So it's not going to just be the Americans. It's going to be the Americans along with a balancing coalition of other countries that are going to try to contain China. And of course, at the same time, the Chinese are going to try to expand. So what you're getting now, and you're going to get much more of, and it's a tragedy here, as Tom told you. The title of my book is The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. This is a tragic situation. I'm not happy about this. In fact, I hope I'm proved wrong. But what we have here is a situation where 2 gorillas, the Chinese and the Americans, are going to go head-to-head and in an intense security competition. And there is going to be a serious chance that they end up shooting at each other and that you have a real war between them. I'm not saying that's likely. I'm just saying that is a serious possibility. Just want to make one more point about this. There's this concept in international politics called the security dilemma. And the security dilemma is going to make this situation all that much worse. What exactly is the security dilemma? The security dilemma says that anything that one side does for defensive purposes to defend itself is invariably seen by the other side as offensive in nature. There's all this talk in the wake of Secretary of State Pompeo being here about putting missiles in places like Australia, Guam, South Korea, and Japan. These are these intermediate range ballistic missiles and cruise missiles. The Chinese have lots of these missiles, by the way. The Chinese say, our missiles are defensive missiles. Your missiles are offensive missiles. We, of course, think exactly the opposite. Their missiles are offensive weapons, and what we're doing is for defensive purposes. So what happens in this situation is you get this arms race going. And, of course, you can see the arms race happening already. Pivot to Asia, right? You get this arms race going, and the end result is that everything the Chinese do to defend themselves, we see as evidence that they're offensively oriented, and vice versa. And this just exacerbates the situation. So there's big trouble ahead. Now, let me just say a few words about Australia. As you all know better than I do, this really creates an extremely difficult situation for Australia because it depends so heavily on economic intercourse with China. And of course, at the same time, it depends on the United States for its security. So Australians have a sense that they're sort of caught in between the United States and China. And by the way, if you go to South Korea, you go to Japan, and you go to other countries, Singapore, the Philippines, they all feel the same way. So this is not unique to Australia. So the question is, what is likely to happen in the future? My view on this is that the Australians have no choice but to side with the Americans. This is not to say that Australia will stop all trade with China, because I don't believe that will happen. But I do believe that the Australians will have no choice but down the road to balance quite clearly with the Americans. Because my bottom line, which should be clear from my argument here, is that security concerns always trump prosperity or economic concerns. Survival is the highest goal any state can have. Security matters the most. So I think from Australia's point of view, it makes eminently good sense to ally with the United States. And I believe Australia will do that, Japan will do that, and so forth and so on. All of this is not to deny that this is not a happy story. And again, it's a tragic story in many ways. Let me just conclude with one final comment, and that is to say, what you should all really hope for is that China does not continue to grow. Thank you.
So, John Mearsheimer, just to summarise succinctly, your argument is that if China continues to grow strongly, economically, then it will convert its economic power into military power, and that it will try to kick the Americans out of Asia, just as the Americans kicked out the Western powers, the European powers from the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century.
Yes.
And that America will go to great lengths to ensure that China does not dominate Asia. That's your argument. Are you exaggerating China's strengths? Because there are many sinologists, such as Professor David Shambar from George Washington University, who was here a few months ago, and they point out that China has some very serious weaknesses and limitations. The corruption at the political level, the environmental problems, the air pollution, the water pollution, the ethnic tensions, and that's not to mention demography, the expression that China will grow old before it grows rich. Are you exaggerating China's strengths here?
There's two issues here. One is the question of whether the problems that Tom described will manifest themselves in ways that greatly slow down the growth of the economy, and therefore limit greatly its military capabilities over time. I have no idea whether that will happen or not. I've given the talk that I gave to you folks probably 125 times. This is probably about the 126th time I've given it. It's hardly changed since I first gave it in 2001, and I've given it in China probably about 25, 30 times, this talk. And one of the principal points that's made against me, including by very smart people inside China, is that the problem I'm describing is never going to happen or occur because China is not going to continue to grow. And as I said to you folks at the end of my talk, let's hope that's the case, okay? But that's one issue. The other issue, and this is a very important issue to think about, is how much military capability does China have today vis-a-vis the United States? Is the United States sort of on the verge of being a paper tiger today vis-a-vis the Chinese military? I think today that the United States would clobber the Chinese in most conflicts one can imagine, most plausible conflicts. The United States military is a very formidable fighting force, and the Chinese military has great limits. It's over time, as China continues to grow economically, that the balance shifts against the United States. This is why Deng Xiaoping made a really smart plan which called for the Chinese just to grow and wait until they got powerful enough to change the balance of power in Europe in their favor. For example, if you're China and you're interested in taking Taiwan back, you do not want to do it now with military force. You want to wait 20 or 30 years, okay? But what this tells you is that it's in America's interest to pick fights with China now to establish the rules of the road. I don't know how many of you remember this from the Cold War. I'm talking mainly about the old dogs in the room because the younger people wouldn't realize this. But in the early part of the Cold War, right, the United States and the Soviet Union had no rules of the road for dealing with each other. We were kind of blind and trying to figure out how to deal with each other. And the same thing is true today with regard to the United States and the China and the question of how to deal with the South China Sea. It's very hard to know exactly what to do. And my point, Tom, is it's in our interest to establish those rules now when we are more powerful than the Chinese, whereas it's in China's interest to wait.
Yeah, but see, your critics would say you're basing your thesis on great power politics, the tragedy of great power politics, on history. You mentioned the 19th century, obviously, with the United States' rise as a great power. But haven't we, since the end of World War II, and especially since the end of the Cold War, have a rules-based international order that should keep China in check? How would you respond to those liberals who'd make that argument to you?
No, we do have a rules-based order, but the only countries that are required to always obey the rules are countries like Australia. The United States, first of all, you understand the United States writes the rules, and we obey them when it suits us, and we disobey them when it doesn't suit us, right? So there's some truth in that as well. But listen, I'm not against rules and having an international order. I want to be clear on that. The reason that the United States created this rule-based order in the West during the Cold War, and the Soviets created a rule-based order in the East during the Cold War, is that to run the modern world, a great power needs institutions and it needs an order, right? But the point is that those rules are written to benefit the great powers so that they can wage security competition, number one, and number two, if they don't like the rules, they just disobey them.
When we did our event on Sunday with the Secretary of State, we also had the Foreign Minister, Marise Payne, present, and she made a big deal about how Australia values that rules-based international order. But when I asked her, why doesn't Australia do follow-up freedom of navigation patrols through that 12 nautical mile zone in the South China Sea, she couldn't really answer it. Does that surprise you?
No. I think that her answer was basically the smart answer, that at this point in time, it does not make sense for Australia to try and enforce the rules, that it would make much more sense for the Australians to pass the buck to the United States and let the United States pay the costs of enforcing those rules. I think there's no question that Australia has an interest in seeing the Chinese obey those rules. But do you want to enforce them? No, not in my opinion. I say this from an Australian perspective, not from an American perspective. You have much more of an interest in letting the Americans do the heavy lifting.
But John, if we don't want to enforce those rules, doesn't that show that a lot of Australians are right to say we can sit on the sidelines in this intensifying strategic competition between Beijing and Washington?
Well, you can sit on the sidelines with regard to this particular issue at this point in time. The question you have to ask yourself is what happens as this security competition that I described intensifies, right? You've been able to get away with sitting on the sidelines up to now, to playing both sides. And it's been very smart from an Australian point of view. I understand what your incentive structure is. The question is what's going to happen as the security competition intensifies. And you have to choose sides.
Okay. Now, if indeed that does intensify that strategic competition, and we had a flavour of this during the course of the week in the aftermath of the Osman negotiations on Sunday, if Washington really wanted, say, Darwin to station mid-range missiles, should Australia do it?
It's a very difficult question to answer at this particular point in time.
And we should stress they're conventional, not nuclear.
Yeah, right. This is a very important point to understand. The INF treaty that was just thrown in the wastebasket prohibited the United States and Russia from deploying intermediate range missiles that could be either nuclear or conventional. So when the Americans talk about deploying those missiles now or at some point in the future in East Asia, it really matters whether you're talking about nuclear missiles or conventional missiles. And I'm assuming they're talking about conventional missiles. And I think a good case could be made for deploying conventional missiles, right? Where and how many from an American point of view is hard to say. And what makes sense from Australia's point of view is just hard to judge at this point in time because we don't know exactly what's going on. My guess would be that the Americans will put great pressure on Australia to deploy those weapons.
Now, a couple more questions before we open it up to the audience. You're debating Professor Hugh White in Canberra's Hyatt Hotel tomorrow night. It's another CIS event. We're expecting 550 people. His argument, as you know, is that China, and these are facts, China buys double what our next largest customer, Japan, buys from us. The Chinese economy will grow much bigger than America's in coming years. He reckons that Federal Treasury projections show that China's economy will be 80% larger than America's economy in the next 12 to 15 years. He also says that our China ties, and I think this is a fair assessment, saved us from the global financial crisis more than a decade ago. As a result, and this is Hugh White's argument, Canberra would be unwise to support Washington in a confrontation with China that America probably can't win. John Mearsheimer.
Well, again, I mean, the question on the table here is whether or not Australia is going to side with the Americans or it's going to side with the Chinese. I fully understand that from an economic point of view, poisoning relations with China makes no sense. And one could argue it would be disastrous in certain respects for Australia over time. But the question you have to ask yourself is, does that make sense, aligning yourselves with China from a security point of view? Can you really imagine Australia aligned with China against the United States? Is that going to happen here? You realize you would be an enemy of the United States then. If the United States is involved in an intense security competition with China and you're with China against the United States is going to be awfully angry and it's going to go to great lengths to put its gun sights on you. You understand, the United States is a ruthless great power. That was the point that I tried to make in my discussion of how America turned itself into a regional hegemon. So this is a tragic situation. I would say, however, that I think you White, overstates the weakness of America vis-a-vis China. It may be in 40 or 50 years that China fits that description, that you lays out, but we're nowhere near that point. And for the foreseeable future, there's no way the Chinese are going to run us off the table or run us out of East Asia. The United States is a very big and very wealthy country, and it has the most formidable military on the planet. And of course, this is why you will have such a powerful incentive to ally with the United States. And of course, you'll have a powerful incentive to do everything you can to ameliorate that competition, that security competition between the United States and China. It will be very hard to do because they're both gorillas. But you have an incentive in doing that so that you can maximize the amount of economic intercourse you have with Australia.
Sorry about the light. I hope you can see me, but we'll try to rectify that. One final question. What about, you might be right about China's weaknesses in the foreseeable future and America's strengths, but what about American staying power? Because many pundits believe that the Obama administration had pivoted away from the so-called pivot, and during the Trump era, again, Hugh White, but he's not alone, are saying that America is showing signs of not just being war-weary from those wars in the Middle East, but also retreating from Asia. You've got the former Defence Secretary, Bob Gates, who, of course, worked in both the Obama and the Bush administrations, and he says that Washington's polarisation, dysfunction, gridlock, partisanship, that's the biggest threat that America faces. He says, quote, this is Bob Gates, "I think the greatest national security threat to this country at this point is the 2 square miles that encompasses the Capitol building and the White House."
Well, there are two issues here. First of all, there's the dysfunction in Washington. It's true. It's almost embarrassing to be an American these days and go abroad and have to defend our body politic. But in terms of staying power, I think it's ridiculous to argue that the United States is showing signs that we're quitting East Asia. If anything, we're up in the ante on Taiwan. We're just in the process of consummating a huge arms deal. We've made it clear we're going to defend Taiwan, right? Pompeo was here and Esper was here for a good reason. The United States is not leaving East Asia, right? And the only problem that we really have, it's not so much what's happening inside the Beltway, political dysfunction. The main problem we have is the forever wars in the Middle East. What we got to do is get out of those crazy wars and stop starting new ones in places like Iran and concentrate on China. That's the main problem. But the fact is the United States is so rich that it can fight the forever wars and still be deeply involved in Asia and be involved in Europe as well, right? And by the way, if we get into trouble, right, financially, we just pull all the forces out of Europe and swing them into East Asia and pull forces out of the Middle East. But it's not even clear we have to do that because we're so rich. And the American economy is not in terrible shape these days. So I think the United States has tremendous staying power. I think its policy making has not been wise for the most part. Tom showed you my book, The Liberal, The Great Delusion. That talks about American foreign policy during the post-Cold War period up to Trump got elected. And it's not a pretty story. And that's why Trump got elected, by the way.
So, to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of America's decline or retreat from the region are greatly exaggerated. Now it's time for Q&A. Our first question comes from Mike Lyons, right here, and we'll go around. Mike, microphone, mate.
Only a few minutes ago you said, I think, we have no choice but to side with America.
You're right.
Because I'm becoming a Mearsheimer groupie, I heard you say yesterday that if we don't side with America and we side with China, we become an enemy of America, which sounded very threatening. And in your recent book, Great Delusions, if I'm not mistaken, you talk about America's successive failures, one after the other, in its attempts. I agree that China's a different kettle of fish, but in all of its attempts with other smaller nations to impose liberal hegemony on them, it seems to have been a failure. So I just want to quickly read a quote from the late Malcolm Fraser's book, Dangerous Allies. He was referring, I think, to the United
Malcolm
States.
Fraser was Prime Minister of Australia from 1975 to 1983. Yep.
It's only 3 or 4 lines, but I'd like you to respond to what he had to say.
Mike, just put the mic up a bit. Yep.
Yeah, sure. Is that better?
Yep, it's much better.
So he said, our leaders, the Australian leaders, argue that we need to keep our alliance with the United States strong in order to ensure our defence in the event of an aggressive foe. Yet the most likely reason that Australia would need to confront an aggressive foe is our strong alliance with the United States. We need America for defence from an attacker who is likely to attack us because we use America for defence.
John Mearsheimer.
Well, let me just, before I directly address that, I just say I wasn't being threatening or trying to be threatening in the sense that I was, saying the United States will come after Australia. But I do think it's pretty obvious that if Australia were to side with China, you would be, by definition, an enemy of the United States. And you can figure out what will come from that. That was simply what I was trying to say there. The second point that you made, reading from Malcolm Fraser's book, I agree with. I think that Australia has no choice but to form an alliance with the United States. But there are costs associated with that. And it gets down to the whole issue that Tom raised about placing missiles on Australian soil. One of the reasons that Australia will not want to do that is because it then becomes a target. But it may be forced to do that because of alliance dynamics, right? So I think that Fraser was right on the money.
Okay, next question, Professor Bruce McKern, formerly of Stanford University and the US Study Centre. Bruce.
Professor, I would just like to come back to the point you made earlier about America's enduring military strength. Are we not already at war with China in the sense that there's a cyber war taking place there, which has been useful to China to strengthen its country economically and militarily? And is the US doing enough to be able to strengthen its ability to handle cyber war?
I think whether you want to argue we're at war with China depends simply on how you define war. I like to make the argument that we have effectively declared war on Iran and that we are trying to strangle Iran economically. And a number of my friends have said you shouldn't refer to that as a war because a war involves guns and shooting. But I think you can make a very good case that we've declared war on Iran. And I think you can make a case, I don't think it's as strong, that we're at war with China in terms of cyber, right? But it's just a definitional issue. But I think your point is well taken, right? That the two sides are engaged in a competition at the cyber level. I think, based on what I know from talking to people in Washington, that the United States is pouring an enormous amount of resources into waging this conflict. And it's a conflict that's being waged not only with China, but with Russia and with Iran. And if you read the literature on the Iran-US competition, what we expect them to do is retaliate with cyber, and we are using cyber against them. So you could say you can add that to the economic dimension, and we're already at war with Iran, not only on the economic front, but on the cyber front as well.
Next question, Andrew Lowe.
Could I put it to you that it's not so much that Australia faces a choice as a whole series of choices around different things. And the reason I say that is that for the 14 countries that have a land border with China, it may well become a binary issue. For the countries in the first island chain, it probably becomes a binary issue. For the countries maybe even the second island chain, it becomes a binary issue. But for Australia, which is almost as far away from China as it is from the west coast of the US, isn't it more likely that we face a series of different choices? And there may be areas around cyber and intelligence where it does become a binary choice because you can't sort of participate in certain things with the US and in China. So you need to choose which boat you sit on. But then there will be other things where it's perfectly legitimate for us to be neutral.
What would be an example?
Now, the US may not like that.
What would be an example of that?
Well, the South China Sea might be an example.
Well, we don't do phone-offs.
Or that may be something where we say it's actually not in our interest. Now, you say the US may say we would strongly like you to do that, and there may be a lot of pressure. But if you're just looking from the Australian national interest, you might take a view that you don't have to be all in on every issue. You can actually pick which issues you align strongly with the US on, which ones you're neutral on, and which ones, and trade is an obvious example where we might actually sort of be in favour of the Chinese perspective on certain things.
Well, I think, I have not thought about this in any detail. I think that your point about Australia's geography is well taken. Australia has really terrific geography. A country like South Korea, Korea in general, the two places on the planet that have the worst geography are Poland and Korea. It's no accident that Norman Davies wrote a book about Poland called God's Playground. And, Korea's in a similar situation. Vietnam, these are all countries that are really close to China, and they have real problems as a result. And your point that they have less flexibility, I think, is true. The question is, how much flexibility, how much choice does Australia have? And my argument would be, in the final analysis, there are not going to be many cases where it has the ability to opt out on some policy issue that the Americans care about. What struck me about the Australians over time is how loyal they have been to the Americans, how they pretty much do anything the Americans ask them to do. For example, I'm quite surprised, although I shouldn't be, that the Australians have agreed to participate in the Persian Gulf to protect shipping in that area. If I were playing Australia's hand, I would not have agreed. Yeah. But they agreed. And I remember when I was a boy, they went to Vietnam with us. And they've been involved in a lot of our crazy ventures. So I think you make a good point, and it may be that times have changed and that Australia will have more maneuver room than my argument conveys. But I don't think they'll have a lot of maneuver room, and I don't think they'll ever be in a position on an important issue where they can side with China, because the Americans, I think, and again, I don't mean to sound threatening here, but I think the Americans would come down on them like a ton of bricks, just because that's what happens with great powers in these countries.
Next question, Alison Bronowski.
Alison Bronowski, Professor Mearsheimer, pleasure to meet you in person rather than on the radio.
Thank you.
Interested to hear you say that Australia has agreed to take part in the Persian Gulf. You must know something that we don't know. I don't think this has been officially announced in Australia yet. I'm not surprised, but it would be nice to learn it from Australia first. Secondly,
I think that's right. I don't think it actually has been announced, but the speculation is that we will do it.
I thought reading the newspapers this morning that Australia had agreed.
Maybe we're reading the wrong papers. We won't start on that one. Alison, question.
I hope you're right. You say that the United States, of course correctly, has the largest military on the planet and remains extremely powerful economically. All of this is, of course, true. My question to you is, given the fact that the United States, with or without Australia in some cases, has not won a single war since 1945, what would give Australia confidence that you would win one against China? And why would it be in Australia's interest to take part in that war, given that this is our part of the world, China is extremely important to us, and that we have a physical relationship with this part of the world that the United States does not, that actually affects our existential survival? And I cannot understand, and perhaps you can tell me, what benefit would Australia get from aligning itself in a security sense with China, with Australia, and doing away with getting on with our neighbours, including China, the way you suggest? Security? What security? Protection? What protection?
A lot of people make the argument that our isolation Yeah, we're way down under guarantees our security. In a way, I think Alison partly reflects that argument. What would you say to that?
Well, before I get to that, can I just answer the first part of her question, which is very similar to your question about America losing all these wars? First of all, there are 4 cases where the United States went up against peer competitors. And in all 4 cases, we prevailed. And this is the 5th case, right? Now, if you talk about wars like Vietnam, wars like the Iraq War, wars like Afghanistan, those wars you're going to lose every time. And we were out of our minds to get involved in all 3 of those wars, right? The United States Army is not good at nation building. And given the power of nationalism, you want to stay out of those places. But I would not extrapolate from what happened in those wars to what is likely to happen in a security competition involving China and the United States. Okay, then different kettle of fish. Now, the question is, can you sit on the sidelines? Okay, so you're going to sit on the sidelines, right? And are you going to continue to trade with China and feed the beast? Yes. And what is that going to mean for the United States? The United States is just going to sit there and let Australia continue to trade with China and feed the beast. You see how interested Donald Trump is in wrecking the Chinese economy. You understand that that's what we're doing. We're trying to wreck the Chinese economy. We do not want them to be able to implement China 2025, where they dominate high tech in the year 2025. We don't want that. We don't want them to continue growing over the next 30 years the way they've grown over the past 30 years. So you're going to help feed the beast. You're going to trade with China and basically ignore us. I don't think that's going to work out too well. I don't think the United States is going to be happy about
More questions. Now, next one, Tony Berg. Yep.
Professor Mearsheimer, thank you for your presentation. And I'm moving away from Australia back to the great power rivalry. And I think you make a very incisive and persuasive case about the great power rivalry. Having said that, it strikes me that both countries, China and the United States, have very smart people at the top. Maybe one of them doesn't, but at the very top. But there are smart people there, and presumably they read your articles and your books, and they see the persuasiveness of your case. Why can't they get together and say, this is not a good course to go on? Let's work out some rules whereby we don't have that inevitable conclusion that you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually the U-White argument as to how we can solve this problem, that we can have some sort of condominium or some sort of concert where the United States and the Chinese realize that if they do what I say they are likely to do, it leads to potential disaster, if not real disaster. They can't do it because the system gives them very powerful incentives as they get more and more powerful, as the Chinese, because the Chinese are driving this train. The Americans are happy with the status quo. Gives the Chinese very powerful incentives to alter the status quo. If you're in Beijing and you're getting wealthier and wealthier, and your military is getting bigger and bigger, and you know that the best situation on the planet is one where you dominate the region of the world that you live in, right? The incentives for you to try and push the Americans out are just enormous, right? Because there is, again, no higher authority, can never know the intentions of another state, and you just want to dominate your region of the world. So it's the Chinese who are driving this train. And the Americans, of course, understand that if China dominates East Asia, that will have huge negative repercussions for them. And they, therefore, have powerful incentives to prevent it. This is why we have never had a single case where really smart people, right, sat down and figured out how to get out of this dilemma, right? It's my argument is it's a tragic situation. The Chinese have no choice. The Americans have no choice. And there's no way out of it.
Now's as good a time as any is to say that John will be debating Kevin Rudd on the ABC's Radio National tomorrow afternoon on my radio program. He also did Philip Adams on Monday night. You can get it on podcast on the ABC. And speaking of Philip Adams, his producer's right here, Sasha Fagan.
You've talked a lot about the ruthlessness of the United States in terms of its foreign policy over the last 200 odd years. And I just wonder, you talked also about how Australia's always come to America's aid in all of its foreign adventures, but the US hasn't always come to our aid in our foreign adventures. I'm thinking, for example, of when the Howard government asked for the US's support to go into East Timor, and the US found that it was not in their strategic interest to get into a war with Australia against Indonesia. I just wonder if at some point, although you say Australia doesn't have a choice but to go with the United States, if we might become expendable at some point to the United States, and if at some point, 40, 50 years into the future, and if so, would you agree with Hugh White's argument that from our defence planning's point of view, we need to become more self-reliant because our military capabilities at this stage are all, built around interoperability with US forces. So do we need to be spending more on our own defence and become more self-reliant?
Well, as is clear from everything I said, I do think that great powers are ruthless, and I think the United States is no exception in that regard. And if the United States found itself in a situation where it made sense from an American point of view to throw a country to the wolves, the United States would throw that country to the wolves. This is the way international politics works. I'm not saying this is a good thing. It's just the way it works.
But on that note, though, there'll be people in this room who'll say, are you downplaying America's benign intent? Look at the noble role the United States played in rebuilding West Germany in Japan after World War II, as an example.
No, my answer to her is an answer to you, which is the United States does what's in its interest. We didn't rebuild West Germany for noble reasons. I don't know where you got that idea.
I also work at the Radio National.
He's supposed to be a realist. I'm just joking. No, the United States rebuilt West Germany and rebuilt Western Europe for purposes of containing the Soviet Union. The great advantage that Australia has is that the United States needs Australia, and it has no reason to throw Australia under the bus, right? So, yes, we're talking about in a competition with China, right? So I don't think that the United States is going to abandon Australia or the United States is going to do something to hurt Australia. It may happen inadvertently for the reasons that Malcolm Fraser described. You get involved in an alliance and there's, you can get entangled in ways that you otherwise wouldn't want to. That happens. But I think the problem that you describe should not be a serious concern. I actually think the Australians have more leverage over the United States than they realize because the United States needs Australia, right? I think Pompeo's visit illustrates that. Pompeo is here because he knows we need you. Right, that's what he was saying. That gives you leverage. But I don't think in the past, based on my understanding of U.S.-Australian relations, that the Australians have realized that. I think, for example, going back to the whole business of Australia going to the Gulf, I think if the Australians tell the Americans, we're not going to the Gulf, right, we're not getting involved in that mess over Iran, I don't think it would damage U.S.-Australian relations in any way because we need you against China.
Peter Harcher from the Sydney Morning Herald.
John, Peter Harcher. 120 countries in the world count China as their main trading partner. 68 countries so far have signed up to China's Belt and Road Initiative. How many countries forcibly are resisting Chinese expansionism?
Well, I'm not sure exactly what your point is. All of these countries have good economic relations with China. There's no question about it. China is an expansive power. China is not simply interested in East Asia. It's going to build the Blue Water Navy. The Chinese will tell you they plan to control their sea lines of communication that run from East Asia through the Straits of Malacca into the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf. The Belt and Road is designed not just for economic purposes, but for security purposes. This is good old-fashioned power projection. And the Chinese are interested in being a superpower, just like the United States. There's no question about that. Your question is, who's pushing back? Not many people or not many countries are pushing back at this point because it's early in the game. As you surely know, the Americans are now only beginning to push back. Right? We are early in this game. The question is, what does it look like over the next 20 or 30 years? But if you go to places like Vietnam, you go to places like India, Singapore, Philippines, Japan for short, Taiwan, South Korea, there are lots of people in those countries who are really scared of the Chinese and would like to see the Americans contain the Chinese. But the problem that they face, and the reason that they're not pushing back very hard, is the same reason that Australians are not interested in pushing back very hard, which is there's all this economic intercourse between these countries and China. And the argument that I'm making to you is that this situation is in the process of changing. And at some point down the road, Australia, and not only Australia, but a lot of other countries, are going to have to figure out which side they're on. And by the way, we could go to Europe and talk about this. When it comes to balancing against China, the Europeans are going to play hardly any role at all. They're not going to be in the balancing coalition. These are countries that are getting weaker and weaker every year, and they had very little power projection capability to start with. Nevertheless, the Chinese are going to want to trade extensively with the Europeans, and they're going to want to trade in dual-use technologies, the kind of technologies we are not going to want the Europeans to give to the Chinese. The Europeans are going to have to decide whether they're with the United States or whether or not they're with the Chinese. And this will have all sorts of consequences for the American commitment to Europe. Again, you can see these problems that are beginning to manifest themselves. If the Europeans are trading dual-use technologies with the Chinese and basically telling the Americans to take a hike, I don't think the Americans are going to be very happy about that. And they're not going to want to leave forces, military forces in Europe to protect the Europeans in that situation. Right? But this is all coming. Again, I told you that, we need a theory to think about the future. And we need a theory because the future hasn't happened yet. And maybe I'll be proved wrong. Maybe someone like you, White, will be proved correct. And apropos the question I was asked before by Tony, maybe the Chinese leaders and the American leaders, with the help of the Australians, will be able to figure out a clever way to get out of this. Maybe that'll happen. Okay. I may be wrong. Let's hope I'm wrong.
James Curran, Professor.
Don't bet against me.
James Curran, Professor of Modern History at the University of Sydney.
Thanks very much. I wanted to take you back to the relationship between domestic politics and foreign policy. I wonder whether you're making an assumption, which I wanted to question, about the capacity of the United States to mobilise, the capacity of American will to mobilise to contain China. And indeed, I think at the moment the message from the Australian government is to the United States is it's not in the Australian national interest the United States to go down the path of containing China. If you read Scott Morrison's speech, the Prime Minister from late June,
AsiaLink,
to AsiaLink, and if you compared that to Mike Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute last October, could almost be forgiven for thinking that these two leaders are talking about completely different regions. Where the Americans see darkness, Australia still sees a pretty bright potential future. But the question about domestic politics is Trump has tapped into something visceral in the middle America. That is, here is a middle America that has said to the American foreign policy establishment, we have withdrawn our consent for an ambitious American foreign policy abroad. You told us it would be the end of history in 1989. You told us that as China would liberalise parts of its economy, it would become just like us, it would democratise. You told us that Iraq would become a Jeffersonian beacon of democracy in the Middle East. I'm being devil's advocate here. It didn't happen. What happens then to that question of American confidence and its exceptionalism when it loses some of its virtue? And to what extent then can American will in the heartland be mobilised for what really is a quite profound struggle against China to be number one?
Well, first of all, American exceptionalism is largely irrelevant here. What we're talking about is dealing with a peer competitor, right? And there's no question that the Americans are fed up with the forever wars. And Trump was elected on the platform that he was going to end these forever wars, which are stupid wars that we're going to lose. The Afghanistan war is now the longest war in American history, and it's perfectly clear we've lost, but we can't get out, right? But that's not what we're talking about here. We're talking about a potential peer competitor. And it's very important to understand that in the United States, the military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, the industries that support that military are fully prepared to deal with China. And furthermore, if you look at the high-tech industry in the United States, the high-tech industry is marching arm in arm with the Pentagon against China. The high-tech industry, the Silicon Valley people are scared stiff of China. They think the Chinese are going to eat our lunch. China 2025 scared the living bejesus out of them, okay? So it's not like it's just the Pentagon that's pushing to have a containment policy against China. A huge chunk of the business establishment is fully in favor of containing China and is fully supportive of what Trump is trying to do to the Chinese economy. You can divide the business community in the United States crudely into two parts, the finance people and the high-tech people. The finance people, as you folks here in Australia know, they'll do deals with the devil, right? The finance people are interested in making money and cutting deals with the Chinese. But the high-tech people view this as a completely different situation, and they're marching arm in arm with the Pentagon. So we're not going to have any trouble mobilizing the American people. And as you know, James, the American government is brilliant when it comes to manipulating public opinion to support even cockamamie wars, right? And this one will be an easy one, to mobilize.
Now, I should stress, John will be here until 8 o'clock to take any individual questions. So if you haven't had a chance to ask a question, fear not, you'll be able to ask one. Final question, David Liebling.
Professor, as you said, what you have is a theory. It seems to me that at the heart of your theory are two glaring omissions. First, you said going back to Canada, and you omitted culture. Now, nobody in Canada does not sleep at night because the US invaded when Canada was a British colony. People are comfortable in Canada that US will not invade because culturally they do not mind who will be in power in 10 or 15 years because, as you said, we don't know who that is. But we do know what the culture of the US is. We know what the culture of Canada is. Drawing that comparison to China, we get to the position that China has never been a world expansive power, and it is against its culture. Its culture is to be dominant of its region, but there is nothing in its culture that suggests that it would want to invade or dominate US or Australia. The second omission in your theory is an assumption. It's an assumption that the world has to be unipolar, not to be in conflict. In fact, the most successful period in world history in terms of liberalism, in terms of free borders, and in terms of trade was 1870 to 1914, when the world was multipolar. I was wondering how you respond to those two omissions.
Yeah. I think your point that you only get peace in unipolarity, right? What I'm saying there is that in a unipolar world, you only have one great power. So therefore, you can't have great power war. You can have great power wars in bipolarity because they're two great powers, or in multipolarity, as you said, because there are three or more great powers. But also, as you pointed out, you don't have constant war. As you pointed out, from 1870 to 1914, no great power war in Europe, right? Also, from 1815 to 1853, that's the Crimean War, 1815 to 1853, that's another big window where you didn't have war. But you did have great power wars. In unipolarity, you cannot have a great power war because there's only one great power. So that was my point. My point is unipolarity's gone, right? And we now have three great powers, the United States, Russia, and China. And the two great powers that matter are China and the United States. And the argument that I'm making is this is a fundamentally different world than the unipolar world that we knew from 1990 up until 2017. Okay, so that's the argument. Now, your more important point is the point about culture. He's correct. There's no culture in my story. It's just very important to understand that. There's no domestic politics in my story. I don't care whether China's an authoritarian state or it's a democracy. There are a number of my friends who believe that if China was a democracy, Japan's a democracy, India's a democracy, the United States is a democracy, we would live happily ever after. This, Tony, is the sort of argument that in a democracy, you have enlightened people who share the same values, who get along, and so forth and so on. I disagree with that. But of course, we're never going to run that test because China is not a democracy. But with regard to culture, I don't believe, I may be wrong. Again, I don't want to say I'm right, you're wrong. But I don't believe that culture matters. I believe that if you look at Chinese history carefully, they have been a remarkably expansive country over time, right? I have a former graduate student who wrote a book on this. I can give you the citation for the book that lays this out in considerable detail. There's some people who believe that China has a Confucian culture, right? Whenever I go to China and people say, oh, we have a Confucian culture, we never cause any problems, you cause all the problems. I always say, I've heard that somewhere before. I think it's called American exceptionalism. Right? We never cause any problems. It's always the other guys who cause all the problems.
But just quickly, John, how does your thesis then apply to interwar Germany? Do you really think that Weimar Germany, a democracy, would have gone down the route of militarism in World War II just like Hitler and the Nazis did?
Yeah, I do believe that that Weimar Germany was expansive. It was bent on changing the status quo. It was bent on changing the borders that the Versailles Treaty had created after World War I. I think Stresemann was interested in revisionism, and I believe Germany would have pushed for World War II in the absence of Hitler. But I would be a fool to argue that Hitler didn't matter. But where Hitler really mattered was that he brought Murder Incorporated along with the army. So it was not only an expansive power in the sense that it was interested in dominating Europe in a geopolitical sense, it was also interested in murdering huge numbers of people. By my count, and I could run through the numbers if I had the time, but I won't, I believe that the Germans in World War II murdered 22 million people, okay? The number's often given that the Soviets lost 24 million people. Most of those were lost at the hands of the Germans. Most of them were civilians, right? And they murdered huge numbers of POWs as well. This was Murder Incorporated. This is what you got with the Nazis, right? So you had this sort of geopolitical imperative that I described driving Nazi Germany. And on top of that, you had Murder Incorporated. And I believe you would not have had that with Weimar Germany.
Okay, so that's a weakness in your thesis.
Yes, but let me just say one word. I don't want to get into this in any detail. No theory can account for everything, right? It's very important to understand that a theory is a simplification of reality. The fact that I leave culture out, that I leave domestic politics out, that I leave individuals like Hitler out, right, does show you that the theory has limits. And this is why I may be proved wrong. I'm going to be humble here, really. But at the same time, I would just say I do believe that there is a lot of history that backs me up. And again, let's hope I'm wrong.
Ladies and gentlemen, can I please call on my colleague, Anastasia Lin, who is the 2019 Scholar in Residence at the Centre for Independent Studies, to do the vote of thanks.
Well, thank you, Tom. As the great 19th century liberal John Stuart Mills once said, he who only knows his own opinion knows little of that. Now, I'm saying that because clearly in the audience today, many of you disagree profoundly with John Mearsheimer's thesis this evening. But in any intellectual discussion, it's important to know the contrarian view. And also, growing up in a totalitarian regime, I know too well when a prevailing idea is not challenged, what the outcome can be of that. And I think tonight, John Mearsheimer stated clearly and thoroughly the importance of viewing China as what it is and how Australians should take China's threat more seriously. It is an important counter-argument to the conventional wisdom in Canberra and in much of Asia-Pacific these days that too often they take a benign view of China. Now, whatever you think of John Mearsheimer, I think he is an intellectual heavyweight. And on behalf of CIS, I thank you sincerely on coming to Australia this week. And we're very much looking forward to your debate with Hugh White tomorrow at Canberra. Now, I want to thank you, too, the audience, for being here tonight. In this increasingly polarizing times, it is very important that CIS, an organization like this, provide a safe space for rigorous exchange of ideas. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.